Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our next edition of our monthly sustainability webinars. Now, this month, we're looking at understanding climate-related metrics. You know me by now. You would say I'm missing my partner, and you are right. Kevin Frobers unfortunately cannot make it today, but he'll be back next month. Clients are keeping him really busy. So Kevin will be back next month. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and we pay our respect to elders past and present, and we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We are here on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. So if we look at the sustainability webinar series that we've been running during 2024, we've slowly worked our way through the anticipated AASB S2. And then, lucky for us, in September, AASB S2 was issued by the Australian Accounting Standards Board. So we've been looking at a sustainability roadmap. We've been looking at carbon accounting. We've been looking at setting carbon targets, the role of voluntary and mandatory reporting, and in particular, over the last 3 months, we had a heavy focus on climate-related risks, opportunities, scenario analysis, and focusing on processes and policies. So this month, we are continuing on that climate-related focus, which obviously is the focus of AASB S2, climate-related disclosures. And we're looking at understanding relevant climate-related metrics. And then in November, we'll be looking at setting climate-related targets. And finally, on the 18th of December, we'll round off the year where we specifically look at all the disclosure requirements in the new AASB S2. So today, climate-related metrics. I would also like to remind you and invite you to join our carbon accounting masterclasses. So we are starting next Wednesday in Brisbane. I'll be flying there on Tuesday evening, Melbourne Cup Day in Melbourne, obviously. I'll be leaving that evening. I'll be in Brisbane on the Wednesday. I'll be in Sydney on the Friday. Then I think next stop we'll have the virtual session on Tuesday, the 19th of November. The Adelaide session has been cancelled. We had low number of people registered and we've asked them to join the virtual session instead. Then Friday, the 22nd of November in Melbourne, and Perth on the 10th of December. Please get your registrations in as soon as possible. We are nearing capacity after we've had full capacity in May as well. More than 100 people already registered, so please register for that. Then I also want to promote our monthly IFRS and corporate reporting webinar series. Last week we talked about share-based payments. In November, we've got a really important session where we do an update on financial and sustainability reporting, getting organizations ready for 31 December 2024. So it will not just be financial reporting. We're also looking at sustainability reporting for 31 December 2024. And then in December, we take a sneak peek at the brand new IFRS 18 presentation and disclosure in financial statements. That is a big change, and we'll slowly start to introduce it over the next 12 months. So that's all our webinars. Now today I'm really fortunate to have one of our BDO partners join me, Mark Pisacalla. He's a partner here in Melbourne, and he's here to talk about our professional network that we've established at BDO. It's been running for many years, Mark, called BDO Connect. So I'll hand over to Mark.
Thanks so much, Aletta, for having me along today. My name's Mark. I'm the national lead for BDO in relation to BDO Connect. And a lot of people say, well, what is exactly BDO Connect? And if we go to the next slide, Aletta, you'll see that it's basically a collection of either SME accountants, boutique advisors, lawyers, but also in-house accountants and in-house professionals as well. And essentially, we've got a database of thousands of people that fall into that category, and we essentially look after them when it comes to things that potentially fall outside their skill set. So it could be that you have a complex tax problem. It could be that you need a valuation done on a business. It could be that you need some other service that you don't deliver on, which might be audit. So all of those things, we connect you with the right people, hence the BDO Connect. You also are entitled to exclusive member benefits such as direct access to BDO experts, telephone inquiry service, where if you'd just like to shoot the breeze or use someone to act as a sounding board for a problem that you've got, we can do that as well. You receive regular technical updates, training, seminars, and the ability to network at our conferences and other activities and events that we have throughout the course of the year. And just onto the next slide, Aletta. You'll see there that, you know, we've been very successful. As Aletta said, we've been around for 20 years or so in one form or another. And, you know, there's some key success principles for us. And that is that, you know, if you're an advisor and you're ringing us, we certainly do not poach your clients. That's definitely not what we do. We're here to work with you to help you get an outcome either for your business or for your client's business. Return calls within 24 hours. And, you know, we genuinely care and act as a team. So when you come through to our call line, you may even get me. And so, you know, we make sure that we connect you with the right people. And we're here for the long run. So we're not here to, you know, whilst we're all here to generate revenue and make some money, that's fine. But really, the main reason we're here is to be here for the long run, to make sure that you're getting the appropriate connections within the BDO network. And also, if we don't think we can offer you whatever it is within the BDO network, or we think there's a better provider out there, we will recommend that other provider. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is what we do to make sure that you get the best outcome and result, you know, for
Mm.
yourself or for your clients. Uh, on the next slide is, I think my terrible picture. So you can hover above that and you get access to all of my monthly 3 minutes with Mark videos. But more importantly than that, on the next slide, if you hover over the next slide, you can actually register and be a member of BDO Connect. And it's a very quick and fast process, takes a minute. And you can join the BDO Connect network and be part of the greater BDO family. So really looking forward to having whoever would like to be on board to just join up and be part of the BDO Connect family. That's all I wanted to say, Leda, and thank you so much for having me along today.
No, thank you very much, Mark. And what I've thought, I'll maybe just go back to this slide. I really like the way you've articulated this, Mark. And I know I've been speaking to some of your clients or people who are
Yep,
BDO Connect members, and maybe they've got a complex accounting question, and we would help them with that. Maybe it's sustainability, maybe it's a particular tax aspect. And it's important for us, if you as an advisor contact us, put us in contact with your client. We don't poach your client. We support you to provide value to your client. And I think
absolutely.
that's really important. If we start to poach your clients, we are not here for the long run, and you won't stay connected to us as well.
No,
So it's
it's
been really
not a very good
lovely.
business model.
It's not a good business model at
No.
all. Um, and you know, I've been really fortunate to work with some of the BDO Connect members during my time at BDO,
Hmm.
and it's always a joy to collectively work with clients. Thank you for all of that, Mark.
Okay. Thanks, Leda, and all the best for the session today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So today's agenda, we're back to sustainability. We've got four key sections. The one is why the need for climate related metrics and targets. Why do we talk about this at all? We've talked about climate related risks and opportunities, processes, systems, but you know, why do we need these metrics and targets? Then we look at a section on the TCFD guidelines regarding climate-related metrics. So in this session, although we start quite wide and ask why do we need metrics and targets, we then go quite narrow and look specifically at metrics, because next month we'll be looking at targets. So we then go to the TCFD guidelines and we just focus on metrics, as discussed and recommended by the TCFD. Then we go on to the more recent standard, a AASB S2, and we're looking at regarding climate-related metrics. Maybe something to note here, in the second section when we talk about the TCFD, it's guidelines, it's voluntary, it's recommendations, quite high level. When we go to AASB S2, it becomes requirements. If you fall within that mandatory regime with the Australian legislation, it's no longer voluntary, and therefore we now have mandatory requirements. And then finally, we have a number of examples. So in the first section, why the need for climate-related metrics? Now, I think we've talked about this over the last few months, that according to the new legislation, the annual report will consist of an annual financial report, an annual sustainability report, a director's report, and an auditor's report. So this is for those organizations that are captured by legislation, that are either Group 1, Group 2, in its basic or in its foundation, it would mean all entities currently lodging financial statements with ASIC. So it's quite far-reaching. This annual sustainability report that's been introduced has to be S2. So in AASB S1 is only voluntary, but this annual sustainability report will mandatorily have to comply with AASB S2. Now, what we know is, if you look at a bit of a helicopter view of AASB S2, it's got 4 pillars. We've got the governance pillars, the strategy pillar, the risk management pillar, and then very importantly, lucky last, the targets pillar. And in metrics and targets, they're looking at climate-related metrics, and in particular, the importance of carbon footprint and disclosing your Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Then there's another metric looking at, or another section looking at all the other climate-related metrics. So the two together make up the metrics required by AASB S2. And then finally, under metrics and targets, there's a section on climate-related targets. So today, we'll be looking at climate-related metrics, your carbon footprint metrics, and we'll look at other climate-related metrics. And next month, we'll be looking at climate-related targets. So you can see here that over this year, we have journeyed through the governance pillars, the strategy pillars, the risk management pillars over recent months, and now we're at metrics and targets. The other thing to note is we know that AASB S2 is really an extension of and a further development of the TCFD recommendations. The TCFD recommendations are voluntary, recommended by the ASX, by ASIC, by APRA, many organizations worldwide. We know ASIC as that 70% of 75% of those entities, ASX 200 entities, are already complying with these TCFD recommendations to some extent, not necessarily everything. But the TCFD recommendations have a similar structure. There's governance, strategy, risk management, and finally, metrics and targets. And if you look at metrics and targets, the very first recommended disclosure is disclose the metrics used by the organization to assess climate-related risk and opportunities in line with its strategy and risk management process. And then one just below is disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and if appropriate, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and the related risks. So today we're going to focus on the other metrics, but we'll also touch on Scope 1, 2, and 3. And then finally, the third disclosure or section there is describe the targets, which we'll look at next month. So just want to reiterate again that AASB S2 is an extension of the TCFD recommendations, and actually applying and voluntarily adopting the TCFD recommendations while you're waiting for a mandatory application of AASB S2 would be a really good stepping stone to get ready for AASB S2. So that's why we're talking about all these metrics and targets. Our TCFD recommendations, our reporting standards are saying after you've talked about governance, after you've thought about strategy, after you've considered risk management, how do you now monitor this? How do you continuously identify and assess potential risks? How do you make sure that your strategy is achieving the right outcomes? What are those metrics that you're focusing on? So in the next section, I thought I'll go back to the TCFD guidelines first of all, because this is what already is in place. It's already available voluntarily. So let's start there, and then we'll build onto the next section. So how has this evolved into the AASB S2 disclosures and the requirements? In the TCFD recommendations, they've started around metrics and targets. They started with guidance for all sectors. So all sectors, all entities should consider the following. These are the key principles that they've included for all sectors. So the first one is that organizations should provide the key metrics used to measure and manage climate-related risk and opportunities. And then they refer to a table which I'll show in future slides. And they say, these are the climate-related risk and opportunities we're talking about. How do you measure? How do you manage? What metrics do you use? And then they also say, make sure that those metrics are consistent with cross-industry climate-related metric categories. So it's not just about your organization, but what do others in your industry use to measure progress, to manage risks. So that's a starting point. I think that's important, and we'll look at that a bit more. Then they also say, very specifically, organizations should consider including metrics on climate-related risk associated with a number of key things. Metrics around water, around energy, around land use, and waste management. Obviously, to the extent that it's relevant and applicable to your business. So a key call out for water, for energy, for land use, and waste management. Then they also say, and this is an interesting one, the third bullet point, where climate-related issues are material, organizations should consider disclosing whether and how related performance metrics are incorporated into remuneration policies. So if you look at your remuneration structure for executive, for key management personnel, how have you adjusted that to put emphasis on climate-related issues? And remember, only if it's material to your business. We're not going to include metrics and KPIs into remuneration policies, if it's not a material item that we want the executive to focus on. But that call out to remuneration policies is really important. We want to incentivize the leaders to do the right thing, and not just do the right thing, they will be remunerated to do the right thing. Then also, where relevant, organizations should provide their internal carbon prices as well as climate-related opportunity metrics, such as revenue from products and services designed for a low-carbon economy. So if we've got internal carbon prices, so this is not a real price, it's not a real amount of money that the division or the company have paid, but it's we add an artificial mechanism to discourage people or to get people to at least think about the carbon consequences when they make financial decisions and decision making in the organization. And also, if we are developing new products, new services to facilitate and to help this transition to a low carbon economy, let's call that out separately and to what extent that's been successful. Um, a high level principle that metrics should be provided for historical periods as well to allow for a trend analysis. Just looking at the current year or even the current year and the comparative year, maybe not that useful. So can we look at it over a period of time on a nice graph? And then also provide forward-looking metrics for the cross-industry and climate-related metric categories. And again, they refer us to a table, which was discussed in previous webinars, but we'll touch on again. And how does that align to our business or strategic planning time horizons? Important, if it's not very clear, organizations should provide a description of the methodologies they've used to calculate or estimate climate-related metrics. I think it's an incredibly important point. In order for organizations to compare what you've done with what other entities in the industry is doing or what other entities, full stop, are doing, it's important that you disclose how you've determined and calculated your metrics. Otherwise, it could be that users of these information are not comparing apples with apples. It's important to say how you've calculated it and make sure it stays the same over time. Or if you want to change the calculation, call out that you've changed it in a particular year, because that might lead to a significant change in the graph that is being presented over time. So some high level things to think about for all sectors, high level principles. If we look at those climate related risks, we know we've got physical risks and transition risks. And previously we've talked about physical risks, what are the acute risks, the chronic risks. And from a transition perspective, we've explored policy and legal risks, technology risk, market risk, or customer risk, as well as reputational risk. So this is really circling back to that. So this is a copy of slides that we've used in the session where we talked at climate risks. But I think the link here is that we have to articulate and an organization have to decide which metrics to measure and report. And you will only pick up metrics that is linked to the risks that you've identified in your climate risk assessment. So there's a real link between your climate-related risks that you've identified and the metrics that you pick to monitor and measure progress around those areas. So your metrics have to match the risk, because ultimately we are concerned about the potential financial impacts on the numbers in the financial report. So here it's a reminder of the various physical risks, how that could potentially reduce revenue because we've got decreased production capacity, or maybe we've got reduced revenue and higher costs because we've got negative impacts of climate risk and physical risks on the workforce. And maybe we've got early retirement of existing assets, etc. So depending what is the key risk for your business that you want to monitor, you might come up with different metrics that you want to focus on. So maybe you want to focus on staff absenteeism because it's linked to potential changes in weather pattern. And that was one of your key risks. Maybe you want to monitor retirement or damage to key assets. Maybe you want to monitor water supply, because that links to increased or potential increase in operating costs. So I just want to flag again that you don't have to come up with these metrics out of nothing. You go back to, what are my climate related risks? Which risks have I identified? What did we think? What could be the impact of those risks? What could be the financial impacts of those risks? And then come up with metrics to monitor. So we want to be able to come up with metrics to help us with early identification with the potential problem, so we can have some corrective action to address that. So we also talked about policy and legal risks. And again, we talked about, there could be higher compliance costs. There could be increased insurance premiums. So maybe we want to keep an eye on insurance premiums. Maybe we want to keep an eye on asset impairments, specifically early retirement of assets due to policy changes. Maybe we want to talk about demand for products per service line. Maybe we want to measure fines and judgments. So these are all ideas of metrics you could implement if you thought policy and legal is a risk for your business. The same with technology. Again, we have the item of write-offs and early retirement of existing assets, monitoring demand for products. Maybe we consider research and development expenditures. Maybe we monitor that. Maybe we monitor capital investments. Maybe that is a key metrics, because we want to articulate that we needed capital investment in order to be relevant and to address these climate-related risks. And here you can see that we've continued to have capital investments, etc. So bring it back to your risk. That's the number one communication here. If you look at market risks, again, how can we identify shifts in consumer preferences? We talked about waste. There was a specific call out around energy, water, and waste at a high level. So maybe we should monitor the costs associated with energy, water, and waste treatment. We could be worried about unexpected shifts in energy costs. So again, let's look at that. Maybe there's changes in our revenue mix, etc. Reputation, again, around demand for goods and services. It would be a worry if we've got decreased production capacity, or if we've got problems in planning approvals or supply chain disruptions. And again, the ability to attract a workforce, and maybe the health of that workforce, and then maybe capital availability. So these are all good suggestions for metrics that you might want to monitor. Now, we've done the same for climate-related opportunities. So we said resource efficiency, there could be a lot of opportunities. In order to have a metric to measure how we're dealing with this opportunity, it could be efficiency gains, it could be production capacity, it could be the values of fixed assets, etc. If you look at your energy sources, again, it could be, fossil fuel prices. It could be the use of fossil fuel. It could be GHG emissions. It could be the cost of carbon, etc. Many things linked to energy. Products and services. Again, we can talk about there's insurance risks. What adaptations we've done. Do we have any information around consumer demands, consumer preferences? Markets, the same thing. What information do we have about partnerships with governments? What information do we have around green bonds and infrastructure? So maybe a metric is, to what extent are we using green bonds? And resilience, again, looking at reliability of the supply chain, looking at new products and services, So very important to come up with metrics to ultimately support the climate-related opportunities that we've identified. So, a few months ago, we talked about a climate risk assessment, a climate risk and opportunity assessment. That document is an absolute critical document because it informs so many other things. It informs your scenario analysis, it informs your financial modeling, it informs the metric that you choose to measure and disclose. So I would also say if you're looking for assistance with these climate um, risk and opportunity assessments, please reach out to us. We do a lot of those, and we then also link it further to, the financial metrics. So they refer in that TCFD document specifically refer to cross-industry climate-related metric categories. So they come up with categories, and they kind of explain why they think this is an important thing to consider. Now, GHG emissions, I think, is obvious. We know there's a pressure on measuring your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, measuring your emissions intensity. Investors would want to know, customers would want to know, etc. But also around, if you look at transition risks, we look at the amount and the extent of assets or business activities that are vulnerable to transition risks. And this could be an amount of assets or a percentage of assets or a percentage of the business that we think is vulnerable to transition risks. So I think that's another important metric to consider. If you look at others' physical risks, again, the amount and the extent. So it could be a dollar amount, or it could be a percentage of your assets or your business activities that's vulnerable to physical risks. So, for example, if you've got 100 locations over Australia, how many of those assets and potentially the value of those assets that are subject to significant physical risk, how many of those assets would be in a fire zone, a flood zone, etc.? So you could say the amount, the value, the market value, or it could be the percentage of those assets, and you're looking at physical risks. Another one to, I think what's important there, and it's there's an asterisk, and I've put it right at the bottom of the screen. Due to the challenges related to portfolio aggregation and sourcing data from companies or from third-party fund managers, some organizations find it quite difficult to quantify their exposure to climate-related risks, in particular these physical risks. So the task force suggests that financial organizations provide qualitative and quantitative information when available. So whatever you can find, make it available to assist with that communication and decision making. Also, let's look at metrics around climate-related opportunities. So potentially the proportion of the revenue and the assets or other business activities that's aligned to climate-related opportunities. So, if you've identified significant opportunities, what part of your business is pursuing that? What part of your revenue is coming from that opportunity? Because that will give good information about what could be expected from future. So again, this is all guidance that addresses all sectors, things to think about. Another one is climate or capital deployment. So what is the amount of capital expenditure, financing or investment that the organization deployed toward climate-related risk and opportunities? So I think that will be a good indication to what extent the organization is resilient and responding to climate-related risks and opportunities. And then another one was this internal carbon prices. So put in a price on each ton of GHG emissions used internally by an organization. As you know, most divisions in a business will have their own divisional profit and loss or divisional budget. And if people don't have a consequence of GHG emissions in their financial budget, it would be easy for them to not think about it. As soon as there's this internal carbon price that has an impact on their budget and their divisional P&L, they will think twice to do something that has a higher carbon emission, because there will be this additional expense in their P&L. So that's just to help with decision making and focusing attention. And then the last one, remuneration. The proportion of executive management remuneration that's linked to climate consideration. So it could be a percentage, a weighting, maybe a description of to what extent we've got these linkages. I should also do a call out. A number of our people advisory and also tax partners do a lot of work in this space. How do you structure remuneration of executives to get them to focus on the right things and the strategic initiatives of a business? And more, there's that consideration of how do we bring in remuneration linked to climate-related issues or sustainability-related issues. So again, all of this across all sectors. What TCFD have done really well, they also developed guidance on banks, for example. So if you are a bank, and whether it's a bigger bank or a smaller bank, what kind of metrics should banks be considering? What would be good metrics for banks? So it could be, the metrics may relate to your credit exposure. It could relate to your equity and your debt holdings. It could be your trading positions, and broken down by industry, by geography, by credit quality, and by average tenor. And again, banks should also provide the amount and percentage of carbon-related assets relative to total assets, as well as the amount of lending and other financing connected to climate-related opportunities. So this is why banks are asking a lot of questions of their borrowers. Banks, even under the TCFD regime, were encouraged to disclose their carbon-related assets, the extent to which they finance low carbon transitioning activities. So really important to do that. And then they also said banks should describe the extent to which their lending and other financial intermediary business activities are aligned to a well below 2 degrees Celsius scenario. So I think that's a really important aspect to remember. So banks already have to do this under TCFD recommendations. There's also some guidance for insurance companies. Um, so insurance companies should provide aggregated risk exposure to weather-related catastrophes of their property business. So you buy relevant jurisdiction. So what is their exposure to these climate weather-related catastrophes? And also they should describe the extent to which their insurance underwriting activities are aligned to well below 2 degrees Celsius scenarios. So are they insuring businesses that are on a journey to a low carbon economy, for example? So that's important that insurance call that out. And we know a lot of insurance companies, again, are having these conversations with people who want to get insurance. There's guidance to asset owners. So again, if you're an asset owner, whether it's a super fund or a managed investment scheme, describe the metrics that you as an asset owner use to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in each fund or investment strategy, and maybe how these metrics have changed over time. They should also provide metrics on how what metrics are considered in their investment decisions and monitoring. Really important, we're seeing a huge shift in asset owners' globally, but also in Australia, where asset owners are demanding certain information, are demanding the entities in which they invest to commit to a low carbon transition or low carbon economy, their carbon footprint, setting targets, monitoring their progress against that. So a push from asset owners, but also a push for asset managers. So if you're the manager, again, you should describe the metric used to assess climate-related risk and opportunity in each product or investment strategy. And if it's changed over time, disclose that. So asset managers should provide metrics considered in investment decisions, in their monitoring. And they should also describe to what extent the assets under their management and their products and their investment strategies are aligned to well below 2 degrees Celsius scenarios. Um, so really important that asset owners, asset managers, insurers, banks, everybody on this journey. And then finally, they have guidance for non-financial groups. So for other groups, organizations should consider historical trends, forward-looking projections, by country, by jurisdiction, by business line or asset type. Um, Organizations should consider disclosing metrics that support their scenario analysis and their strategic planning, and their risk management perspective. So what we do for strategy, what we do for risk management, all of that should influence and inform the metrics we come up. And then finally, the third bullet point, very important, provide key metrics related to greenhouse gas emissions, your carbon footprint, metrics around energy usage, water, and other physical risk exposures, for example, land use, investments in climate adaptation and mitigation, etc. So a large number of ideas coming from the TCFD. And this has been in place for many, many years. And just to reiterate that AASB S2 is building on that. So all those recommendations would be good things to consider to give you ideas. However, if we go on to AASB S2 and we look at climate-related disclosures, and today we're just focusing on the metrics and targets. Now, you would have seen the TCFD recommendations, there's only 11. And then there's a lot of educational material saying, think about this, consider this. But it's all guidance, voluntary. AASB S2, and there's a link to the standard that was issued in September, put in requirements. And look out for the use of the word shall. So often you find the word shall. So paragraph 28, to achieve this objective, the objective outlined in paragraph 27, an entity shall disclose the following. You know, in accounting standards, you often see the word shall. It's mandatory. It's not optional. It's not a nice extra. You have to do the following. So on metrics and targets, there's a section on metrics and targets, but I'm just calling out metrics. We'll talk about targets next month. In this section, you will also see that on 2 or 3 places, the AASB has deleted text from IFRS S2. So at a very high level, AASB S2 is highly aligned to IFRS S2. What the AASB have done to make it very clear where they've diverged from IFRS S2, they would put in, so paragraph 28B has been deleted, and then in an appendix, they have the text of paragraph 28B that's been deleted. So if you want to see what did they delete, what is in IFRS S2 that's deleted, you can see it in the appendix, but in today's presentation, I've included it in a little red block, so you can see immediately what's been deleted. So if you look at the objective across metrics and targets, if we go back to paragraph 27, the objective of climate-related financial disclosures on metrics and targets is to enable users of these general purpose financial reports to understand an entity's performance in relation to its climate-related risks and opportunities, including progress towards any targets it has set and any target it is required to meet by law or regulation. So again, it links it back to your climate-related risks and opportunities. You've identified these risks and opportunities, and earlier you've disclosed what they are, but how are you tracking, and what's your progress? How are you monitoring these risks and opportunities? In paragraph 28, they start by saying you shall disclose information relevant to cross-industry metric categories, so that industry aspect. They've also said in paragraph C, 28C, targets set by the entity, which we'll talk about next month. The paragraph that they've deleted is 28B on the right-hand side, and that is they've deleted the requirement, the mandatory requirement to include industry-based metrics that are associated with particular business models, activities, or other common features that characterize participation in an industry. So that specific industry-based metrics have been excluded. It's still voluntarily available. When they talk about climate-related metrics, they start off in paragraph 29 focusing on the greenhouse gases that we measure under the greenhouse gas protocol. So they say the greenhouse gases shall be disclosed, and it should be disclosed as a carbon dioxide equivalent. You have to be classified under scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. It should be measured under the greenhouse gas protocol. So that is really important for us. So it brings the greenhouse gas protocol in. Also talking about you disclose the approach that you've used to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. So your measurement approach, your inputs, your assumptions, the reason why you've chosen that measurement approach, the inputs, the assumptions, any changes that you've made in your measurement approach, inputs, assumptions. So it's not just here are my carbon emissions, scope 1, 2, 3. How did we measure it? And that will be aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol. So it's your basis of preparation, your inputs, your assumptions. Then also for scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, you need a disaggregation between the consolidated accounting group and other investees that's excluded, maybe from applying, maybe being excluded. So, for example, if you've excluded associates or joint ventures or unconsolidated subsidiaries, you still have to include that as well. Against in the next paragraph, your scope 2 emissions, you have to look at location-based information as well. And so there's two methods, and both methods should be included or disclosed. And then if you look at scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, you have to talk about the categories that you've included. There's 15 categories in scope 3. So an additional information about your category 15 greenhouse gas emissions, that's the financed emissions. So that would be if you've got investments in other entities, that has to be included in great detail. If we then move on, so that's the first part is heavily focused on greenhouse gas emissions. But then they go on in paragraph 29B and talk about you have to talk about your climate-related transition risks. So very specific, the amount and percentage of assets or business activities that are vulnerable to climate-related transition risks. So not just this is a risk, what amount and percentage are vulnerable? If you talk about physical risks, the amount and percentage. Climate-related opportunities, the amount and percentage. So this was previously encouraged under TCFD, but now it's mandatory. It's a shall. Capital deployment, the amount of capital expenditure, financing, or investment deployed towards climate-related risk and opportunities. In relation to that internal carbon price, and I've included a definition of what it is on the left-hand side in green, the entity shall disclose an explanation of whether and how the entity is applying a carbon price in decision making. And the price shall disclose the price for each metric ton of greenhouse gas emissions that they use. Paragraph G talks about remuneration. You shall disclose a description of whether and how climate-related considerations are factored into executive remuneration and the percentage of executive management remuneration recognized in the current period that is linked to climate-related considerations. Then also in paragraph 30, in preparing these disclosures, an entity shall use all reasonable and supportable information that's available without undue cost and effort. You have to apply with the disclosures outlined in paragraph 29 above, but also in paragraph B 64 and 65, which is a mandatory application guidance in Appendix B. And then they've deleted paragraph 32. So what did they delete? They've deleted the industry-based guidance on implementing IFRS S2. An entity shall disclose industry-based metrics. So that is mandated in IFRS S2, and that industry-based metrics is voluntary within the Australian environment. I think I wanted to call out in the few minutes we've got left, the application guidance around financed emissions in Appendix B. So they talk about financed emissions, if entities that participate in financial activities, so your banks, insurance, asset managers, asset owners, they face risk and opportunities related to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those activities. So it's important that they consider, if they provide financing, etc., to certain businesses, to what extent are those businesses considering climate-related risk and opportunities and mitigating those. And therefore, in this application guidance, they say that you have to disclose its absolute gross Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions generated during the period, including upstream and downstream emissions, and an entity that participates in one or more of the following financial activities is required to disclose additional and specific information about its Category 15 emissions or those emissions associated with its investments, which is also known as finance emissions. So if you're in asset management, if you're in a commercial banking, if you're in insurance, you have to consider this. And an entity shall apply the requirements of disclosing greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with paragraph 29A, where they disclose this information, which is applying the greenhouse gas protocol. So that is, if you look back, this is general comments around finance emissions. Then they go on in this appendix, and it's a mandatory appendix. It's not an optional extra. They talk about finance emissions when you're in asset management. So what do you have to disclose? They say an entity that participates in asset management activities shall disclose the following. And this is really important. Your absolute gross finance emissions between Scope 1, 2, and 3. For each of the disaggregated items that you've listed above for Scope 1, 2, and 3, and the total amount of assets under management that is included in the finance emissions disclosures expressed in the presentation currency of the entity's financial statements. So really looking at it very carefully. Also looking at the entity's total assets under management included in finance emissions calculation, and also the methodology that's been used. So shall requirements, mandatory requirements if you're in asset management. Also mandatory requirements around commercial banking across industry, across asset class, specifically in paragraph B62, little b1, the funded amounts. The gross exposure shall be calculated as the funded carrying amounts before subtracting the loss allowance, and the undrawn loan commitments. So if there's a bank overdraft facility which has been made available, whether they've drawn on it or not, you have to disclose that. So really important for bankers to disclose a lot of information they are financing. So you can see for most of our clients, this is important to know because banks will need this information for mandatory reporting, and you want to sit in the right bucket here. There's also finance emissions information around insurance and information that they will need to capture. And I'll leave it there for those insurance clients online that can look at that. But again, for you, if you're applying for insurance, this is the information that they have to disclose, and they will ask you for supporting information. There's also some guidance across cross-industry categories, and I've included it there for you so you can see, you will disclose an entity shall consider the time horizons over which these climate-related risks and opportunities could occur. They will consider their business model, their value chain, etc. So it just gives you an idea of required. And remember, this is a small subset of AASB S2. It's a big standard. I want to finish today by flicking through some examples because telling you what the requirements are, I don't always find it as useful. It gives you an idea. But what's an example? What does it look like? Um, First of all, I've looked at the TCFD examples. They've put out illustrative examples. So here you could see this is an example for an energy group, and they have included a financial category of revenues. They've got a climate-related category, which is GHG emissions, risk adaptation and mitigation, water, etc. Then they've included an example metric. So if you look at water, their example metric is the percent water withdrawn in regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. So put in a percentage. And then they've put in a column around alignment. So this is alignment to other standards like GRI or SASB, etc. And they've explained why they thought, what's the rationale for including this. So for example, on water, they've said water stress can result in increased cost of supply, impacts to operations, increased regulation, reduced access to water withdrawal. So the percentage withdrawn in high water stress areas in significant cost or limitations to production capacity. So this is a really good example that could be relevant for an energy group or that sector. And it goes on to the next page as well. I've also put in a transportation group. So, there's a climate-related category across energy and fuel, maybe sales weighted average fleet fuel economy by region and weight or the number of people transported. There's a number of categories across risk adaptation, mitigation. There's energy and fuel again, the total fuel consumed and the percentage renewable for road, airlines, marine and rail, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So that's for transportation group. Just a few ideas to get you thinking. A materials and building group, again, if you look at the categories, risk adaptation, energy and fuel, water. So if you look at materials and buildings group, how would water be relevant? The percent of fresh water withdrawn in regions with, again, a high or extremely high baseline. Materials and buildings, there's more on greenhouse gas emissions, on water. Lots of examples for you to think about. And this one is across agriculture, food, forest products. Another example. So those are from the TCFD. I was looking for some real life examples. I found a NAB example from the 2023 climate report. And this is a financed emissions example. I thought you would find this interesting. So they've had financed emissions. There's a link to the report, but this is an extract from the report. They've broken it down per sector. The two big categories are sectors with targets set and sectors with targets that they're working on. So the sectors where they've got targets were power generation, thermal coal, oil and gas, cement, aluminium, iron and steel, transport, aviation. And the one where the target setting is ongoing was around other transport, commercial real estate, residential real estate, and agriculture. So that's just the sectors on that first column. And then they've split it between absolute emissions across scope 1 and 2 and 3, 2022 and 2021. They've got a portfolio update, and they've got a reference to data quality as well. So this is why the banks are reaching out and asking for information, because it feeds into this disclosure, which will be more extensive in future. Then the other one that I looked at was coals, and there's a lot of metrics in coals. I picked the one across to moving towards a circular economy. And I picked this one because it was linked to waste. And they said our progress reducing waste to landfill. And you can see there's a graph, the percentage of solid waste that's been diverted from landfill over time. So just to give you a few ideas of real life examples. We will see a lot more of these because at the moment, the organizations like Coles and NAB who publish these metrics are doing it voluntarily, aligned with the TCFD recommendations. But all Group 1 and in future Group 2 and 3 companies January 2025 mandatorily have to consider and disclose these metrics. So again, a huge area to explore. How BDO can help, as you know, we've got our 4 key areas, 3 in advisory around carbon sustainability reporting, including what we've talked about today, but also strategy, and then our auditors also provide assurance. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we would love to work with you on this journey. It is a journey. You can register for our insights. We've got e-learning available. But finally, thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. And I'm looking forward to speak to you next month on targets.